I'm Lindsay Galveo from the Education Department of GBH, which is Boston's PBS station. On behalf of GBH, I'd like to thank the Freedom Trail for partnering with us for today's event, and we'd also like to thank the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Gurmishausen Foundation for their support. Today, we're going to have a very exciting conversation with two very important Bostonian women from the time of the American Revolution, Hannah Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. We're so excited to have a conversation about the role that women played during the American Revolution and how these women think about the revolutionary value of equality. But what makes this conversation particularly engaging and special is your questions. So, teachers, feel free to put the questions that your students have in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to them today. Please make sure you tell us your first name, your grade, and your school when you ask a question. Again, we're so excited that you've joined us today. After our session, please check out PBS Learning Media to access GBH's U.S. History Collection and Civics Collection for more resources. These will definitely help you continue the conversations in your classroom. And now I'm so excited to introduce Hannah Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. Would you mind sharing with the audience a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Hannah Adams. I was born in 1755 in Brookline, Massachusetts, to my humble parents, Thomas and Elizabeth Adams. Now, my father, Thomas, he was a Harvard educated man, and so education was very important to him. And so while I originally started going to the local schools, as I became older, I became more sick and I had to spend more time at home. And so because of this, my father, he actually would hire the students. He had divinity students who went to Harvard and they often would board in our home. And so he would hire them to tutor me. And that really sparked my lifelong love of learning. And so as an adult, I'm going to be the first female professional writer in the United States. And that just means that I'm the first woman in the United States to make a professional living from her writing. I'm a prolific writer, but my favorite topics are going to be on the history of New England and, comparative religion. So I'll never marry, but you don't have to worry about me. I have plenty of wealthy friends and patrons who are going to take care of me well into old age.
Wow, that's an incredible story. And Mercy, would you mind sharing a little bit about yourself?
Of course, my name is Mercy Otis Warren. I was born Mercy Otis in 1728 in Barnstable, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. I came from a fairly prominent family. My father was a judge in the community, and my parents were James Otis and Mary Allen Otis. I was the third of 13 children. I had two brothers who also gained some prominence during the American Revolution. And I had the privilege to receive private tutoring alongside my direct older brother, James Otis, who was born in 1725, so 3 years before me. So he and I received private education, just the two of us, learned how to read and write in English, Greek, and Latin. I read extensively, and this meant that as I became an adult, I became an author as well. I would marry a man named James Warren, who was a friend of my brother's at Harvard. I was not allowed to attend Harvard because I was a girl, but I still had a good education and good support from my family and my community. So during the American Revolution, I published a series of plays that were works of protest that criticized the British government in the American colonies. And then after the American Revolution, I became the first historian of the American Revolution, and I published an extensive and detailed history about the events of the American Revolution, my personal experience having participated in and witnessed the revolution, and also the research that I conducted after the revolution ended. I published that book in 1805 and I was 77 years old.
Wow, these are incredible stories and backgrounds. Why was it really important for you to put your ideas into writing?
Yeah, so, there's a couple different things at play here. The first would be my own personal motivations. And so, as far as my first work goes, which is really a book of comparative religions. And so, this comes from my own studying. I'm reading about these different Christian denominations and sects. But these authors I'm reading, I find I'm very disappointed with them. They're very biased in their perspective. Instead of, kind of presenting all of these different ideas as being, equal or worthy of inspection. Instead, they're saying, here's this blasphemous other that you can read about, but you don't really need to know about. And so instead, whenever I'm writing, I'm trying to put the truth out there to, give each one of these Christian denominations space to kind of express their beliefs in a way that felt true to them. In addition to that, later, as far as, writing my history of New England, that was largely motivated by poverty. And so after the American Revolutionary War, I spent many years where I'm essentially on the brink of being homeless. And so because of this, I actually turned to writing as a way to gain patronage and, find small profit. And so I actually decided to focus on New England history because there wasn't a lot of writing out there about that at that time. And so I figured that not only would it be a useful topic, but also something that people would pay to read more about. And so that being said, while I had different personal motivations for why I was writing at different times in my life, overall, I was always interested in getting the truth out there.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. And what about you? What motivated you to write, Mercy?
It's a really good question. So what motivated me to write was primarily my love for history, and the opinions that I had, especially opinions surrounding politics, that I wanted to share with others. I think it really helped that I had a good education. I read extensively, especially as a child. I read a lot of history books. That was certainly my passion throughout my entire life. I also received a lot of support, again, from my friends and family members. And I wrote a lot of letters to them as well, which I used those letters to sort of form the ideas that I had that I would later put into my plays and my poems and my histories as well. Especially during the American Revolution, I was very politically active. I was surrounded by other people who were very politically active as well, people who were involved in the Sons of Liberty, who were protesting against the British government, people who were fighting for American independence. And so I was doing that too. And I was doing that in part by putting my feelings and my opinions into words and into works of art like plays. My plays I published anonymously. My history I later published under my own name, but I still really wanted to get my ideas out there. It really helped that I had the support of men in my life. And that's not to say that I could not have accomplished things on my own, but because I had support and education from my father and my uncle, and I was encouraged to write and express my opinions by my brother and my husband, I had the tools that I needed to get my writing out to people, to get writing published in magazines or published in an actual book, so that other people could read what I had to say as well.
So, were women allowed to participate in politics during the American Revolution?
It's a really good question. And the answer is a little bit complicated because women were not allowed to participate in politics in the way that men were. So women did not hold office. They did not have political jobs. So, for example, my husband was in the Massachusetts state representatives. I would never have been able to have such a job. Um, but I still was very much aware of the politics of the day, what was going on, and I certainly had my opinions, as did many other women that I was in contact with. I was close with women like Abigail Adams, Martha Washington, and Catherine Macaulay, who was a British historian. And I wrote a lot to them. We wrote back and forth and expressed our opinions and our feelings about the events of our day and age. And women during the American Revolution, politics affected them as much as they affected men. So even if they didn't hold positions of power, they were still talking with one another, talking to men as well, expressing opinions, and participating in acts of resistance as well.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great answer from Mercy. And just to add to that, really women were involved in like the political sphere of their own domestic life. And so kind of a phrase that we hear is that women are often the neck that turns the head. And so this idea that women are, using their influence to talk to their husbands, to talk to their children, to talk to people that do have the vote in order to, get their opinions out there and to make a change.
I think it's also important to note that, especially in our New England communities, women were most likely the ones who were educating their own children. If their children are able to attend school, they might receive instruction from a male tutor. But if you have children learning at home, learning how to read and write, or doing some schooling at home, it would more likely than not be the mother doing that education because the children's father would likely be working outside of the house. And so, in terms of shaping the minds of the next generation, that was our job if we had children, which I did. I know that you didn't, but uh, you still sort of played a role in the
Absolutely.
education of the next generation.
Yeah,
So,
so I definitely had my own number of students. And so one of the ways that many women were able to enter the workforce is through teaching. And so certainly women had an outsized influence, not only just of the education at children at home, but then also in the school setting.
Wow, that's really incredible. Can you tell us more about some of the ways that women participated in the American Revolution?
of
Yeah.
course. So, I like to think that I had a pretty active role in the American Revolution. Um, like I said, I was close with and wrote letters between a lot of people who were important in the American Revolution. I had the privilege of being friends with John Adams and Abigail Adams. I wrote a lot to them. Like I said, I wrote to Martha Washington. I got to meet George Washington. My writing was praised by Alexander Hamilton, and I got to know people like Samuel Adams, and other figures like that as well. So I had the privilege and the luck to exist in a really interesting time period. And I was able to be politically active in my own way. I would often host the Sons of Liberty at my own home. I would let them hold meetings and discuss protests and acts of resistance. It was in my home that my husband and I helped to form the Committees of Correspondence in Massachusetts. Committees of Correspondence uh, allowed people to communicate with people living in other American colonies, networks of people sending letters, and that was something that was really important to Massachusetts and to Boston in 1774, because after the Boston Tea Party, the British government shut down the Boston Harbor. So people in Boston and the surrounding area weren't getting food or other necessary items that they needed. It was because of the committees of correspondence and the fact that we were talking to people living in other colonies that we were able to get food and money sent to the people who needed it the most during that time. So that was an act of protest in and of itself because we were going around the government who had shut down our harbor. So that's one thing that I was very much involved in the creation of. And for myself and many other patriotic women during the American Revolution, we would organize boycotts. We would get people to stop buying British goods, drinking British tea, for example, when there was a British tax upon tea. We also would organize a lot of spinning and sewing circles. One of the British taxes that led toward the American Revolution that people wanted to protest against was a tax against imported cloth. And we realized that we could do without the British imports and British goods, and we could do this on our own. And so communities of women all across the American colonies would grow flax and cotton to create linen and cotton fabrics. And then we would get together in groups and help each other through the sort of tedious work of spinning the flax and cotton fibers into thread. And then we would weave that thread into fabric, and then we would sew our own clothing. It became really fashionable to wear homespun clothing and not wear fancy imported silks because, again, it was a protest against the government.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work that happened at home in order to boycott. That's really incredible. Um, I just want to shift gears a little bit. Can you share what equality means to you? What you think about equality?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, in regards to my own life, I found that, in early life, the one thing that I was really drawn towards was education and learning. This is something that really changed my life. But I was frustrated to find that not only myself, but other young girls in my neighborhood were denied that education. So not only were many of the girls in my neighborhood, their education would cease after, 10 years old, things like that. But in addition to that, that they were not necessarily being instructed in the same topics as boys at school. And so while they might have, a couple of classes on arithmetic or reading, they would also be pulled out to focus on other subjects, focused on, their duties as a homemaker. And so it was really after I actually left school that my education became, equal to that of maybe other learned men of my time. So it was only after I started having these tutors work with me at home. And so I think that in my later years, I was really impressed by the way that, girls had essentially improved their access to education. And so kind of looking at this as, the main sphere that I saw equality in my own life, and also where I found the most inequality in my own life was that education early on. And that changed by the time I was in my 70s, and I saw young women able to attend school with their male peers.
So I often think of equality or the lack of equality in terms of government. I was very interested in, again, history and especially the history of different systems of power and governments, and especially because I lived through the development of a new nation, the United States of America, and the creation of what was meant to be a new democratic government. Um, and because I witnessed all of this happening, and I was aware as a historian of the ways in which government can fail people and the ways in which a government can become too powerful and deny people basic rights, I wrote a lot about how I wanted to caution people against allowing government to become that way. If a country is to be democratic, the citizens living in that country should have some level of equality. They should be granted education. They should be able to freely access the things that they want and need. If they don't have access to education, if they don't have access to their basic needs and to the things that they want, things that they enjoy, uh, they will live through something that's really not worth living through. Essentially, it's they will not be able to understand the things that they could have, and they will exist in communities that are not what we want them to be. When the United States Constitution was first drafted in 1787, I wrote about how I was worried about the Constitution because when it was first drafted, it did not include the Bill of Rights. You probably know that was added later on, but I was concerned that without a Bill of Rights and without a very specific set of rules or laws, or at least guidelines to guide a very new nation by, that this nation could very easily fall into a trap of being too powerful, of being tyrannical, and of not granting its citizens its basic rights. In terms of equality or inequality between the sexes, you talked a little bit about the lack of equality for girls and women, and that's something that I certainly recognized as well. I had the privilege of receiving education and support that a lot of women were not granted. So in my personal life, I believed often that men and women did have different purposes in life, and they occupied different places in just daily existence. I still wish that I could have been granted the same education that my brothers did, but I was happy in my home life as well, um, and grateful that I was able to serve a feminine role, a traditional feminine role in my own life, while also being able to write and express my opinions.
And do you think men and women can be equal in this new nation? Do you think that's possible?
I think that time will tell. I think that from the outset of the revolution, as Mercy was saying, that a lot of our questions about equality have more to do about, equality between states. And so this isn't necessarily on the individual level, but more about, the colonies have come to a point where we feel that we're now equal with Britain and that we should be seen in the world as such. And because of this, we now have new language that's going to be put forth by luminaries like Thomas Jefferson. And so if you have the words to support that states are equal, that all men are created equal, then this language can be taken and put onto the individual level. And so I think it does bring questions as to women's rights in this country.
I think that equality can be possible, especially in a nation that's well educated and free and democratic. Uh, Despite that, though, um, I do, I live in a time in which, again, men and women serve different roles in our societies and in our lives. And that is sort of how we are made. So equality for me is less about men and women doing the exact same things and more about men and women being granted opportunities, being able to learn, to grow, to read and write, and um, gain all the freedoms that a proper democracy should have, while continuing to run a happy, healthy society in our own ways. So if I were granted the opportunity perhaps to be a politician, like my husband was and like my brother aspired to be, I don't know if I would take that opportunity, because I was and I am content in the life that I have been granted, and the purpose that I get to fulfill. But again, I'm really grateful that I've had opportunities that other women have not been granted. And I do wish that other women could have similar opportunities to what I have had.
That's really a great way, I think, to segue to our audience questions as we start to think about how equality can affect our opportunities. So, teachers, again, please feel free to put questions in the chat. Please make sure you tell us your first name, your grade, and your school when you ask a question. We're starting to get some great questions coming in. Tessie wants to know, did women fight in the war?
Yeah.
It's a really good question, Tessie.
Yeah, we love that question. So there's one woman in the Revolutionary War who actually receives a military pension. Her name was Deborah Sampson. As far as, the circumstances of her life that led to her fighting and what her exact role was, we don't necessarily have the kind of historical documentation to go into detail about that, but we do know that she was actually active on the front lines and she presented herself as a man.
Yes, she enlisted in the revolution as a man named Robert Shirtliff. So she disguised herself as a man. The first time that she enlisted, though, she did so in a town where people already knew and recognized her. So they said, "Hey, you're a woman, you can't do that." So she went to a different town and enlisted there where fewer people knew her. And she was able to serve for at least a few months with nobody guessing that she was a woman. She was badly injured during a mission in Philadelphia, though, and a doctor caring for her realized that she was, in fact, a woman. So she ended up getting discharged from the military, but she received an honorary discharge because she had served in her position very honorably and very well, equal to the service of a man. So when she retired from the military, she was granted a military pension. Again, even though people knew at that point that she was a woman, she received that military pension for the rest of her life. And when she died, her husband actually petitioned Congress to receive a payment because he was her widower, and she had been a military veteran, and he was granted that as well. So she was the first woman really to serve in the United States Army, and she was the only one, at least that I know of, who served in the military in the way a man did during the American Revolution. There may have been others, we just don't really know who they might have been, and they might have avoided being discovered as women. So she's just one story out of many. But even though most women would not have fought in the war like men did, women still served roles on the front lines, followed the army, and helped keep everything running, and really fought in their own ways, in their own spheres as well.
Wow, so we can say that women have been serving
Yes.
in the military since the nation's founding.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very cool. Room BG10 at Watertown High School has a question for you, Ms. Otis. Were you afraid of criticizing the British?
Was I afraid of criticizing the British? Excuse me. I was not actually. Um, well, a little bit in that I had some level of common sense, but I again came from a community and a family where criticizing the government and speaking openly about it was very much welcomed. And so because that was something that my community and my family were accustomed to doing, I felt comfortable criticizing the government as well. I did also understand that especially as the nation came closer and closer to war, that criticizing an active government could get me in trouble. That's part of why I published my plays anonymously.
Oh,
When I published my plays during the 1770s, the plays that I wrote were fictional, and the people and the countries depicted in the plays were also fictional. They weren't real, but they were definitely based on real life. The villains were based on British government officials, and the heroes were based on the Sons of Liberty and people like my brother. I mean, that was pretty clear that that was the purpose of those plays as well. And stories in the plays were very similar to stories like the events of the Boston Tea Party. So when I published my plays, I used a pen name, a Colombian patriot. So making it clear that I was a patriot, that I was all for, you know, a new United States and for the end of British rule in the American colonies. But I didn't want people to know specifically who I was so that my family, my home perhaps would not be threatened by what I was writing. But I did make it clear that I was a woman writing those plays. So using a fake identity was not to trick people into thinking that I was a man.
oh.
It was just really to keep myself safe and to keep my family safe as well. I had children at that point already, so I had to look out for them too.
You wanted to protect them.
Mhm.
This question comes from Lauren, and she wants to know, did either of you befriend any free or enslaved people, or women rather? And how did you both feel about slavery?
That's a great question. Do you have something in particular that comes to mind?
I do not. Living in Massachusetts my entire life, um, slavery was certainly all around and important, and I was very much aware of the practices of slavery. I really disliked slavery as well in the way that it uh, left people in servitude and in inequality. But I did not grow up in a community or live in a community as an adult where using enslaved people for labor was popular. I lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and by the 1760s, 1770s, uh, there weren't a lot of enslaved people in our area. There were, but not in my own home, for example. And there were other people who I was close with who were equally opposed to slavery, like the Adamses, so John and Abigail Adams. They believed, as I did, that slavery went directly against sort of the wishes of God and the Bible too, and that it was inhumane to keep slaves. I would not call myself an abolitionist, though. I was not especially focused on fighting against slavery. I spoke out against it, but I focused much more strongly on um, the effects of revolution and the events surrounding the creation of a new government. So slavery was not very prominent in my life. That's not to say it was not prominent in the world I lived in the community I lived in. It just did not affect me very much. I also had the privilege of living as a, a white woman from a wealthy background. So I was able to sort of remain untouched by the practices of slavery too.
Yeah, and just to kind of elaborate more on that, because in many regards, My experience would be similar growing up in what was originally a middle class family that fell into impoverishment. Using enslaved labor would not have been common in my community. Now, that being said, I did want to bring up the name of a woman who was actually born enslaved and becomes the first Black author in the United States. So her name is Phyllis Wheatley, and she is born enslaved. She's taught how to read and write. And essentially, she's encouraged to write more. And by the time that she's 16 years old, she was published all across the colonies. And so eventually, taking the profits from that writing, she was able to self-emancipate. And some of her favorite topics were talking about, the importance of the beating heart of freedom. And she had admirers that included that of George Washington. George Washington thought her work was fabulous. And he even said himself that if it was not for vanity, he would have published her poems. And so I just wanted to bring up that, even though this was not necessarily a personal connection that Hannah Adams had, Phyllis Wheatley certainly would have been somebody that she was hearing about and likely reading her work.
Phyllis Wheatley lived in Boston the same time that we lived in the area as well. And in fact, she, even more remarkably, she was not born into slavery. She was born free. She was born in West Africa, and she was kidnapped by enslavers as a child. And what I find remarkable about that is the fact that she became a very accomplished writer in the English language and in the English style. That wasn't even her first language. I admire her work as a poet myself, and admire the voice that she had and the perspective that she had on the same events of the revolution that I also witnessed. Yeah.
That's amazing. I want to keep going with all of your questions and make sure we can get through them. I'm going to combine a couple
Okay.
questions.
Sure.
Tessie wants to know more about what life was like for women at this time. And the Watertown High School Special Ed would like to know what life was like for women who were poor or didn't have the same opportunities that you did. I know you fell into poverty, but you still had an education. So if you wanted to talk maybe what life was like for women who didn't have the means to have an education.
Absolutely. So thank you, Tessie, and both also the Watertown Special Ed class. So thinking about this question, without an education, women's lives were really relegated to the labor that they did for their household. And so, poor women, we kind of have this idea that there was a past in which women didn't work. Women have always worked, especially poor women. The question is whether or not they worked for wages. And so whether they would be supporting their household by essentially acting as the head of the household and running it, oftentimes also running family businesses and the like, or they would actually have to go out and work for wages themselves. If you think about after the Revolutionary War, how many disabled veterans there were who came home and found themselves unable to participate in the labor they had previously, a lot of women would step into those roles. And so it's difficult to, make a blanket statement about what life was like for these poor women, but we can assume that it was difficult in many ways and that they worked really hard.
Also, women like us were not usually granted the right to ownership of land, of a home, or of a business. That doesn't mean that there were no women who did so. Similar to the after effects of the revolution and the fact that there were many disabled veterans or men from our generation who were lost to the war, women of our generation had the ability to own a business, own land, if they had a husband who had passed and he did not have a son who was of age to inherit a family business or home, or he didn't have somebody else lined up, essentially. Women like that could become what we know as merry widows. That's Merry. And what that means is a woman could, be self-sufficient and run a business and wouldn't not actually have to remarry. She could live out the rest of her life without being married again, because she could be self-sufficient and support herself in that way. Again, that was not most women, but we did have ways in which women could be granted those freedoms and privileges. From my perspective, I did not have to work. I, again, came from a privileged background. I really would not have had to receive an education either, but I wanted to, and I think it was really important that I did. Women of my class were mostly expected to be mothers, wives, and homemakers. And that's a full-time job in and of itself. I had 5 sons. And while much of my time was spent raising my sons, I was also privileged to be able to spend extra time, writing and tending to my plays as well. Again, this would not have been granted to every woman. Some women had many children, and all of their time was dedicated to caring for those children, caring for their husband, and caring for extended family members as well. So they didn't necessarily have jobs as you might think in the traditional sense, but that was their full-time job.
Thank you so much. Madison from 3rd grade wants to know, what kind of food did women cook? So kind of staying in the domestic realm.
Oh, I love that, Madison,
That's a
from
really
3rd
good
grade.
question.
That's a great question.
Almost anything that you can think of would be something that we
Cakes.
cooked. During the Revolution too, a lot of the things that we cooked were informed by the boycotts and the protests that we were holding against the British government. Again, this is if we were patriots, which we were. Some women would not have been. Some women would have been in support of the British government. But we stopped buying things like British tea or sugar, and so our cooking had to change. It meant that we embraced a lot of homemade foods and foods that we could grow here, produce and goods that are native to Massachusetts or local to our area. For example, using honey instead of sugar, drinking coffee instead of tea. Coffee had to be imported, but still, it wasn't tea, so that was all right. We would use a lot of fresh fish and meat, and we were lucky to live in a time period in which we could get a lot of food imported from all across the world. But again, when we were protesting against British trade and refusing to pay British taxes, we had to focus a lot more on what we could make at home. So tending our own gardens and farms too. And that ended up being really valuable during the war too, as it was harder to get necessary supplies and we had to be self-sufficient and self-reliant.
So the fact that I'm a coffee drinker means that I would have been an excellent patriot.
Yes,
Oh,
Very
fantastic.
In
Tea
fact,
is very passe.
Okay.
in fact, I have heard that coffee is very popular in your time because of the work that we did.
Oh, well, thank you. I have you to thank for my coffee addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Aurora, who is in 6th grade, she is homeschooled, wants to know what your hair caps and hats are for. You want to talk about your
So very good
dress?
question, Aurora, and anybody else who is curious, as I'm sure some of you are. So these are caps indeed. Perhaps you could call them bonnets, something like that. We wear them every day. We take them off to sleep and braid our hair for sleeping, but throughout the entire day, we keep these on our heads, and they serve a couple different purposes. They keep our hair neat and tidy because, as you can see, all of our hair is tied up beneath the cap and it's not hanging loose. That's safe too when we're cooking or working and we're not getting our hair hanging in things. It keeps our hair clean too. It is not as easy for us as it is for you to have a ready source of water to wash and clean our hair. So to keep our hair clean, we keep it covered all the time, and that prevents anything in the air, any dust from getting in our hair all the time. We can go a little longer between washing it, and it still stays nice.
Yeah.
It keeps our heads cool and warm, sort of temperature regulating, and it makes it easy for us to wear hats. So we're not wearing any hats right now because we're indoors. They don't need to be, but anytime we step outside, we would put a bonnet, a straw hat, or some sort of cap on. We can fasten those caps to these cloth bonnets, and it stays on our head even if it's windy. And really, all told, wearing something like this makes our lives very easy. So it might look a little unfamiliar to you, and it might not be something that you're used to wearing, But I encourage you to try it out sometime. Put some sort of cap on your head, wear it around for a bit, and you'll see how convenient that it might be.
Yes.
I mean, you made coffee popular. Let's make caps popular again. Excellent, excellent. There's so many great questions that are coming in. So my next question for you is from Nativity, grade 5, the Nativity School. Thank you. How did you feel during the war, and were you afraid?
Hello, fifth graders.
Nativity, right? And so, how did I feel during the war? It's not something I wrote about a lot, but I can tell you that during the war, something that Mercy was talking about earlier was the way that women actually took up making their own fabric because of the boycotts on British fabrics and goods. And so during this time, I was doing a lot of lace spinning, and this is actually one of the most profitable things I did during my life. And so, in some ways, I think I felt really invigorated by the support I was getting from my community. This was one of the few times I was able to make a product and support myself from it. And so I think I kind of was looking ahead to the future and thinking, okay, this might be a different world and one where I don't have to live in destitution.
Was I afraid during the war? Yes, I was often afraid. It was a very difficult time and a very uncertain time too. You understand, we wanted to establish a new and independent nation, but that does not come easily, especially when you're dealing with facing the most powerful military in the world. And I was very close to the effects of the war as well, living in the Boston area. Boston was occupied by the British Army for years until 1776. My husband, my brother, and many of my friends were political enemies of the British government because they were very outspoken against British rule. So they were hated by the soldiers occupying our area. They were hated by the British government officials too. And this could put their lives in danger sometimes. While I might not have necessarily been directly one of those who was a political enemy because I published my plays anonymously, if I had been revealed as the playwright, I would have been hated just as equally. And I was too because I associated with these men as well. My husband, for a period of time, was the paymaster of the Continental Army. That was George Washington's army. So with him, I followed the army and helped, keep everything in line for him so that the soldiers serving us might get their pay. So even if I did not fight in any battles, I was still very close to the front lines, concerned that my husband or any other people that I cared a lot about might be the next ones to die. I'm grateful that my sons were not old enough to serve during that time. That would have made me even more afraid, but it was a scary time. And I would say anybody who lives through such a war would feel the same. I'm grateful that we survived and were able to keep fighting back for liberty, that is.
And so you were both self-described patriots. Can you talk a little bit more? Miss C's class in BPS wants to know a little bit more about what it was like to be among patriots, loyalists, if people were neutral. Did you talk to loyalists? What was it like to be in Boston at that time of people were trying to figure out their sides during the war?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I would say that these distinctions of patriot and loyalist are things that really came whenever we were a lot closer to the war. And so the years leading up, oftentimes, these are our neighbors, and the same way that you wouldn't necessarily want to let politics get in the way of a friendship, whenever tensions were a little bit cooler, then certainly we all just went about our life, and these were disagreements we had and differences in genuinely held belief. But as time went on and we became closer to the war, essentially people had to kind of, make their statement, make their mark on what they truly believed. And I think at that point, that's whenever you see more people keeping to themselves and their own community for fear of, what could happen if you associated with somebody who disagreed with you. But of course, Mercy, I think that you have even greater perspective on this matter.
I think it was very exciting associating with patriots and uh, sort of being instrumental to planning the revolution itself. That was a really exciting time, despite the fear and uncertainty. At the same time, like Hannah said, um, the definitions of patriot versus loyalist were very much formed by the events of the revolution itself. For example, my brother, James Otis, was a member of the Sons of Liberty, and he was very outspoken against the British government during the 1760s. He's the person who popularized the phrase, taxation without representation is tyranny, got a lot of people to catch on to saying that and protesting against British taxes. But just a few years before he said such words, he was very proud to be British. I was very proud to be British too. We were British citizens. We were for most of our lives, at least up until the revolution itself. Our families were British. Our families had come over from England generations ago. That was part of our identity and our culture. And until the British government began to change its ways and its policies and started taxing us more and establishing these laws and bringing soldiers into our homes. Before all that happened, some of us praised the government and felt that we were secure and happy living under such a government, even though we were governed by a king thousands of miles away. It was the events of revolution itself, the change of policies, that led many of us to change our minds and to become patriots. And it could be difficult at first to separate our past selves and the way that we used to be from the people that we wanted to be now, the patriots that we wanted to be, and the new country that we wanted to create. I myself, seeing people going about their daily lives, well, that was important for me too, to have a daily life and to spend time with my children and husband between events of revolution itself. I always found it really upsetting to see people who had loyalist sympathies to carry on as if nothing had happened, or to, for example, after the events of the Boston Massacre, to not worry even a little bit that 5 civilians had been killed by British soldiers. How can you continue living your everyday life when things are no longer normal like they used to be?
That's a really powerful point. And I want to kind of keep on this thread about the events of the American Revolution. Callie, who's in 4th grade, she's homeschooled in Illinois, would like to know, were either of you at the Boston Tea Party?
Callie, that's a great question.
And Illinois, what is that?
There you go. Well, one thing I'll point out is that I don't believe that Hannah Adams myself was at the Boston Tea Party, but also we don't know necessarily who was there and who wasn't there because they were all committing treason. And so you don't really want to add your name to a list of I'm going to go commit treason against the British government just so it can be read out against you in the court later. So we have a lot of suspicions about who was there, some confirmed people, but as far as, knowing exactly who was there, it's a little bit difficult to say.
So I was not in Boston at the time of the Boston Tea Party. I will say that much. I, at the time, was spending a lot of time at home in Plymouth, which is a few dozen miles away at least. In addition, I don't know of many women who would have claimed to participate in the Boston Tea Party. And that's not because we as women did not want to protest as much as men did. It was just because it was a little easy to get men very excited about the hard work of picking up heavy boxes of tea and ripping them open and throwing them into the harbor. It was easy to have men participate in that labor and take that risk. Well, we protested in our own ways at home.
I agree.
Men get excited about those sorts of things.
So you both are writers and readers. The Long Beach High School U.S. government class would like to know, did women read Thomas Paine's Common Sense and discuss the ideas either with their parents or their husbands?
They most definitely did.
I absolutely did, I can tell you that much.
Yeah.
Common Sense and other contemporary authors like Thomas Paine, who wrote about these ideas of democracy and freedom and liberty, and the course of governments and nations. Authors like these were really important to informing my own work and my writing. And they were authors who helped me, especially when I wrote my own history later on. Authors that I could refer back to or quote or use as research so that I did not have to rely entirely on my own knowledge and memory about the events of the revolution.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll also say that, as you already know, we as women both read and wrote extensively. And while other women in our communities may not have written as much or in the same way that we did, or at least would not have gotten published in the same way that we did, almost all women who we knew and loved were reading and writing as well. We were all writing letters to each other, certainly. And growing up in New England and coming from an English New England background and from Puritan ancestry, we were lucky that we lived in a community in which people believed that reading and writing was a very important skill for everybody, men and women alike. So both boys and girls were taught how to read and write from a young age. And even if women were mostly using their reading and writing skills for things like reading the Bible or writing letters to friends and family, we still certainly had that skill and could use it however we wanted to. Literacy rates in New England in our lifetimes were very, very high. And I'm really grateful for that fact.
Yeah, reading and writing is really important, right,
Mhm.
students? Chloe, who's in grade 5, wants to know, did women have to wear dresses?
Women have to wear dresses? That is a very good question. And my answer would be yes. But that's not necessarily to say that women would have gotten in huge trouble if they didn't wear dresses. I mean, it was generally frowned upon for a woman to not wear a dress, but it's just what we wear and what women all wore. In the same way, you probably have traditions of dressing and clothing that you wear where wearing something different would be unheard of. And that was really the case for us. We had no reason to need or want to wear a different form of clothing. While some of our dresses and gowns might be quite big and take up a lot of space and be a little bit impractical, there were plenty of skirts and bodices and gowns that were part of our personal collections that made us just as capable of doing manual labor if we needed to, as men were able to. If a woman of a poorer class was working in the fields on a farm, it's perfectly acceptable for her to hike up her skirts and roll up her sleeves and get to work. So she could work just as hard as any man in the clothes that fit her best.
Absolutely. I would say that mostly, like Mercy said, that, wearing anything but a dress would be largely unthinkable. This would be a completely foreign concept. And I would also put out there that the way that women dressed often was one of the few ways that they might be able to express themselves in daily life as well. And so this might be, kind of one of the few ways that women are able to select different colors and motifs to kind of symbolize their status in society. So dress, goes beyond just, what you have on your body, but also who you are.
And again, in our community, forms of dress are very much divided by gender. It's part of what makes it clear to us who is a man and who is a woman. And while these types of clothing can be equally very practical and very impractical too, again, a woman would not necessarily have need to dress in a way a man does, unless she was disguising herself as a man in the way that Deborah Sampson did during the Revolution. I'll tell you a brief story about a person who existed a few generations before us, around the 1670s. They went by Thomas and Thomason Hall, and they lived in the Virginia colony in Williamsburg. They were actually put on trial in Williamsburg when they were a young adult because it was revealed that they were dressing and identifying alternately as both a man and a woman. In that community, which also was made up of colonists from England, just like our communities, it did not make sense to dress as both a man and a woman. You must be one or the other. When this person was put on trial, doctors looked at the person to determine what their gender might be and how that they should appropriately dress. And what they discovered that this person was, in fact, surprisingly neither male nor female. Stranger things have happened in God's kingdom, I suppose, and therefore, the person's perhaps punishment or perhaps privilege, depending on how you look at it, is that the colony asked them to wear both male and female clothing. When Thomason would go out in public, they would wear an apron over breeches as a way to signify that they were indeed neither male nor female. There are others like Thomason throughout our colonies, and while they're rare, they're much a part of our world as we are too.
To continue on thinking about equality and to bring this back together, grade 5 from Leominster, Mass asks, how do you feel about the phrase, all men are created equal, when in fact women had few rights and slavery existed at that time?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that for myself and for many other women, I saw this as being aspirational in a way, this statement, all men are created equal, because of course at that time the usage of the word man did include humankind as well. It didn't necessarily just mean man. And so I think that it was an invitation, or at least I saw it myself as an invitation to include myself in that phrase. And so I think that we'll see both suffragettes and abolitionists later in American history who are going to take that and say this is really a commandment from the founding fathers to institute equality. Now, whether or not that was in their mind when those words were written is almost a secondary fact because they feel so true to every person who hears them.
I think those words are something to strive towards, an aspirational goal. While they may not necessarily represent the reality of our nation, they are representing how our nation should be. Um, and I do believe in my heart that all men, men inclusive of all humankind, like Hannah said, that all men are created equal, even if that is not so in the governments in which we create.
Mm.
It should be the case, but I understand why it is something we are still working towards. Um, because I was close with many of those we call the founding fathers who wrote this Declaration of Independence, I understood that many of them, like myself, were opposed to the principles of slavery, and some of them also believed that women should perhaps be granted more rights. But these were not things that they wrote into this declaration. It took a lot of debate and discussion, but they were having to team up with those from other colonies who believed very strongly that this was not the case, that slavery was useful and important, or that women should serve a different role and sort of be beneath men in terms of status. And so, in some ways, those words end up being a compromise. We had to move forward somehow with fighting for independence and with fighting for the creation of a new nation. We had to compromise in order to get there. Perhaps so be it. I don't know if that is the right choice, but it is the choice that I think we had to make at the time.
Thank you. And one final quick question before we wrap up today. Angel in 7th grade from St. Martha's School wants to know, what did you do for fun?
Hi, Angel. Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah, what did we do for fun? All sorts of things. The main thing I did for fun was reading. I was always going to be in a book. That's the reason why I'm the author that I am. But that being said, I also loved my friends. This is something I wrote about all the time. I had this group of women who essentially were largely widows, penniless, but loved to write. They loved art. They loved chatting. And we all loved to get together and enjoy a cup of coffee.
For my part, I would say very similar things. Even though it was work, I always found it fun organizing the revolutionary meetings that we held. I loved writing letters to my friends and family. I wrote them a lot of letters, especially when we were apart and I wanted to update them on things. I loved my husband, and so I wrote a lot to him. And in his letters to me, he would often call me his scribbler because he was really fond of the way that I wrote so much. I had five amazing sons and had the privilege of raising them and having fun with them too. They were all about 2 or 3 years apart in age. And so having that group of boys all in my house made every day lively. I really enjoyed just getting out and meeting people in my community as well. In fact, the entire reason I met my husband was because I attended my brother James's college graduation. My brother James and my husband James both went to Harvard. And when they graduated, I came up from Barnstable to be there to witness it. And I met my husband because at the time he had become very close friends with my brother. Again, both named James. They were 2 years older than I was.
Oh boy.
And I sort of joined their circle of friends too. The man who would ultimately be my husband was my friend and close confidant for 11 years before I married him and solidified a union between two powerful New England families. So that that community surrounding me was always important to me, just like Hannah too. I always loved reading, especially history. I loved writing too. So everything that we've talked about so far in terms of the work that I did and the job that I had, that was just as much of my passion and what I did to have fun as anything else.
So reading, writing, hanging out with family, it sounds like a fun time to me. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
being here today.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to all of you for joining us today. Again, my name is Lindsay Galveo from GBH Education, and I want to give a big, huge thank you to the Freedom Trail for joining us today. Hannah Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, it was an absolute pleasure. And you have been such an amazing audience. Thank you for your fabulous questions and keep being curious. Teachers, please check out PBS Learning Media for more resources from our U.S. history